cameras and few angles. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and welcome to another edition of Diplo's and the GIP briefing on internet governance and digital policy, this time for February 2022. For those of you that might be new to us, to this briefing, we will be covering the most important developments in February. And we hope that we'll hear also from you. We will involve a number of experts on our side and colleagues that will comment on a couple of key buzzing issues, but we would also like to hear from you. So throughout the briefing, we encourage you to use the chat extensively and share your comments, questions, thoughts, opinions, experiences. But at the same time, feel free to raise the hand, and then we'll occasionally get back to all of you and see whether there are any reflections. And in that case, switch on the camera if you can, switch on the mic, and we want to hear from you. For today, or for the February, this is since this briefing always takes place at the last Tuesday of the month. It's a rather uneasy month because this last Tuesday is not yet at the end of the February. So we had a plan that some of the buzzing topics that we observed in our Internet Governance Barometer that you can find on a digital watch were mainly related to discussions about standards and the role of the ITU, International Telecommunications Union, because that's something that will be evolving in the next years. And there are a couple of events happening at the ITU. We'll reflect on them today as well, on some of them. And the other one was more on cybersecurity aspects, particularly related to the hack against the ICRC, the Red Cross Red Crescent database, and then some of the NSO group developments. But unfortunately, the truth is that, as you observe minute by minute, the news coming in and around Ukraine, that this is becoming again, or is focus of discussions, including on cyber, for quite some time. So today we'll cover two topics and we'll place some focus on that. The first one is the standards. The other one is cybersecurity, where we'll also touch upon the current developments. I won't waste more time. Let's dive straight into the first topic of today's discussion, and that is the standards. And I want to give a bit of a context. standards are generally becoming more and more important and interesting also for various digital policies and political movements around the world. We hear a lot of leaders and national policies relating to issues of standards, and then the standards cut across all the technologies and societal phenomena. But the particular reason for raising it in February is what is coming in the International Telecommunication Union, and that is the World Telecom Standardization Assembly, which happens every 4 years. And it's happening in beginning of March in Geneva. So we firstly invited their associate from the ITU, Dr. Bilal Jamoussi, to tell us a little bit about what is WTSA and what we can expect when it comes to standards from the ITU. And then we'll get back to discussion. So I'll firstly invite you to listen to a brief overview by Dr. Jamoussi. Let's see if we can have the short video on. And with the disclaimer that this is a part of a big podcast that we produced as an interview with him on more broad set of issues when it comes to ITU in the next period. Okay. So we'll put this quote or this excerpt in a few minutes. But let me go straight to a context of standards. And I want here to invite two of my dear colleagues, Sorina Teleanu and Jovan Kurvalia. Well, Jovan, you know, from briefing to briefing, he usually gives us a zoom out perspective of various digital policy issues. And Sorina has been very involved in following geopolitics of standards, if we can call it that way, and why this is becoming so important more and more. So if you allow me, I'll firstly start with Sorina. Sorina, you have been following this discussions about standards and standards popping up in more and more of the political focuses of various governments. Why are digital standards so, well, I guess hot on the agenda these days? Or, I mean, are there any hotter than they used to be in the past? Sorina.
Thank you, Vlada. Hello, everyone. I hope you can hear me well. Indeed, there is this growing attention being paid to standard, let's say, more recently. And there is this increasing realization that standards are not only of technical importance, and they do not only matter for the companies or the technical community that develop those standards. And that's because they have so many other implications, economic ones, starting from facilitating international trade to helping companies become more competitive on the international markets and other related issues. There are these human rights implications that we hear about more and more often these days, and you're probably all aware about the discussions around standards for facial recognition technology or biometrics, which are being developed quite a lot at several SDOs, and there is discussion about how those standards can create a context for protecting or abusing human rights. There is a discussion about the role that standards can have in helping advance sustainable development, and there was this big event organized last September, I think, by some of the key international SDOs and G20. And of course, there is the geopolitical context in which all these standards are being developed and all happening in the backdrop of increasing tech competition between nations. So of course, standards come up as well. And as you mentioned, Vlada, there is quite a lot of discussion around standards in more and more geopolitical settings. We've had this working group being created in the US EU Trade and Technology Council looking specifically at standards. Quad itself is looking at standards in a dedicated working group on emerging technologies, I think. There is a framework for digital standardization at G7. The European Commission has recently launched its strengthened, let's call it, standardization strategy. So there is more and more geopolitical attention Although I think it is also important to note that standards have always had the political and the geopolitical dimension. It's just that now they are becoming a bit more obvious. And again, it is also because of the tech competition between nations, with some countries and their actors becoming more involved than in the past. And on that note, the kind encouragement to everyone to read the report we published last year. It was kind of focused on China and Chinese stakeholder engagement in key SDOs, but we also looked at the broader context and how Chinese participation is compared with the participation of other countries. So in terms of expectations, I guess we can expect to see standards coming up more and more often in geopolitical fora on the agenda of governments, hopefully. But there is one thing we and the SDOs themselves probably should be paying a bit more attention, and that's the so-called standardization gap, and the fact that we do still have stakeholders from less developed countries not so much involved in standardization work. And just this afternoon, we're having a new study published about the participation of countries in the ARIN region in standardization. So on the one hand, Canada and the USA, which are extremely active in standardization spaces. And on the other hand, the smaller countries, the islands in North America, and how they are very little represented in some of the SDOs. And we're also talking a bit about why they should be more involved and how that can happen. And this can also apply to other developing countries. So encouraging everyone to join us later today. And if some of my colleagues can share the link, that would be useful. And I think I will stop here. Maybe later we can talk a bit about the WTSA. I've been looking a bit at the candidates for some of the, well, for all the study groups, to see which countries they come from, but yeah, maybe we can come back to that later. Thank you.
Thank you, Serena. This was quite an interesting zoom out perspective, and I guess there will be a lot of questions, and or it opens space for a lot of questions and comments. And again, I invite everyone to share thoughts in the chat and raise a hand if you wish, and my colleague Ginger Park will reflect a little bit afterwards on the chat developments, and we'll pass the floor to anyone of you that's interested to comment. Before passing the floor to Jovan, if you allow me, let us put on a brief comment by Bilal Jamoussi on what we can expect from the WTSA and the ITU in March, and then we'll get back to a reflection on ITU's role and on standards. So let's hear from Bilal Jamoussi.
So WTSA is the World Telecommunication Standardization Assembly. It was initially planned to be in Hyderabad, India in November 2020. However, due to COVID, we had to postpone it once and then twice. And then we will actually have it from the 1st to the 9th of March this year here in Geneva at the CICG. The WTSA will be preceded by the Global Standardization Symposium. And this year, the GSS is on the theme of international standards to enable digital transformation and achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. Again, you see the important developmental agenda in our standards development work. WTSA, the main decisions that we'll be taking, first of all, is the election of the leadership team for our study groups. We have 11 study groups ranging from fiber optic standards to video coding standards to numbering, tariffs, environmental issues, signaling protocols, Internet of Things and smart cities. All of these 11 study groups, plus the Telecom Standards Advisory Group, leadership team will be elected at the Assembly. And so we have received many nominations from both member states and sector members. The TSB director, myself, and the heads of delegation are working to come up with a slate of leadership, and that will be agreed at the head of delegation meeting. That is probably one of the very important decisions will be made at the Assembly. The other is we received a number of new resolutions, a new proposal for resolutions. One that deals with artificial intelligence. Another deals with the importance of the private sector and industry in the work of ITU. a number of proposals on COVID and post-COVID management and the use of ICTs in managing a pandemic and including having virtual meetings and platforms like the one we're using today. But overall, we don't believe there is really major controversial issues. Many of the topics have been looked at the TSAG, the Telecom Standards Advisory Group, in preparation for the assembly. And then we have some resolutions that might be updated. Some of the cybersecurity resolutions might be updated, for example. But if there is consensus, great, we will update them. If there is no consensus, then there is no change. The current resolutions would be maintained. This topic was discussed at length in study group 13 and 11 last year, and there was no consensus to adopt these new questions and no consensus to propose them at the assembly. And going through the various contributions from the regional organizations and member states, we haven't seen any new proposals on this topic. So for us, that is not an issue at the moment. That is going to be discussed at WTSA. In terms of openness, there has been a decision that all input documents to the assembly are publicly open. So those could be consulted, all the contributions. And there's also a decision that all the output documents are consulted. So the only documents that might be restricted to the membership during the assembly are the work in progress, because they're not final, and it would be inappropriate to release them outside of the members who are negotiating those documents. So from that perspective, the assembly is quite open. We have remote participation at the assembly for all of the members that are duly registered. So I think with those elements, WTSA will be quite an open platform for facilitating access to anyone who could be part of the memberships and the delegations.
Well, many thanks to Bilal for a brief overview of the WTSA. And again, a reminder, this is just an excerpt from, well, not too long podcast, what we call a shortcast, about 20-something minutes of discussion with Dr. Jamousi on the perspectives of the ITU in this year with a couple of important developments. So you can find us on SoundCloud to listen to the full version of the interview. Let me get back now to and reflect on some of the issues and pass the floor to Jovan. Jovan, well, you can reflect on this cross-cutting importance of standards that Serena also mentioned and Bilal. I have an additional question you can reflect afterwards. It seems that there is a battle of embedding values, whether there will be, and governance mechanisms, whether there will be a Western ones or Eastern ones, into the battle over standards. Any thoughts about that? But I'm passing the floor to you, Jovan, and then inviting everyone for comments. Jovan.
Sure, Vlada. Well, our previous speakers outlined the major challenges and developments and dynamics. I will just add a few points. One point is that slowness of traditional international law agreements in field of cybersecurity, data, and other areas are increasing the relevance of the questions of standardization. Therefore, standards will be increasingly used as a proxy for the lack of, let's say, international legal agreements in the UN. Therefore, there will be increasing pressure on the standards, which I think is good news because standards are concrete. They relate to reality, to technical reality. Therefore, this is the first important development that should be kept in mind. We are seeing it here. It comes with good and bad news. Good news is that it will reflect more public interest, reality, cross-cutting issues, values. Bad news is that we will have inevitably some sort of politizations of the discussion. It won't be just technical discussion that we had in past in the most of technical bodies, not only in Geneva, but also at the internet standardization bodies and other bodies. This is the second dynamics. Third dynamics, which is particularly relevant. Through standards, we can reflect cross-cutting nature of digital developments, because currently there is a huge gap between cross-cutting aspects of digitalization from technology, human rights, economy, and very siloed governance in the field of human rights, in the trade and other areas. Therefore, that's important development. And the last trend which we should keep in mind is a return of openness. Openness was for a long time put a bit aside from the mainstream digitalization, but one development made a geostrategic change. It was Open RAN pushed by US government in the context of the Huawei controversy, which basically argued that 5G technology should be developed on the open standard technology. We are seeing more and more of openness push in other standardization bodies. Though it's a good music for, let's say, early internet community and return back to that initial phase. Therefore, in brief, growing geopolitical importance as filling the gap that is created by lack of international agreements in traditional bodies. The second point, cross-cutting aspects, connecting different aspects of digitalization. And third, in particular important, which will follow closely at Diplo, a return of openness in terms of standards, but also technologies. Over to you, brother.
Thanks, and thanks for bringing back this discussion of the openness. And there is an interesting, challenging reflection on that. To what extent actually greater openness of standards could allow countries to be less dependent on other countries and in a way boost the cyber sovereignty and digital sovereignty that maybe now more and more countries would actually be able to produce their own full stack of from technology to applications to services. But we can get back to that. I know that Ginger has raised a hand there, and I see there was a lot of discussion in the chat. So let me pass on to Ginger to see what's happening in the chat. And again, inviting any one of you who might want to comment to raise a hand and jump in. Ginger, over to you.
Thank you, Vlada. And yes, we have quite an interesting audience today, as always. Richard started the chat discussion saying that if you take the long historical view, you can see that governments traditionally did understand that some standards have public policy issues involved. That understanding was sort of forgotten in the 1990s when the internet was developed. It's not surprising that the understanding is coming back, even if there's no consensus on which standards raise public policy issues, nor on where or how to address them. However, he continues that, sorry, just one moment. Consensus in the ITU means no formal objection by any member state. So even if one state objects, there is no consensus. He does agree with Bill Love that he hasn't seen any controversial inputs. Going back to original internet concepts, Jovan reminded us that Leslie was right. Code is law. Continuing in that line, he says, isn't this also an issue battle for forum shopping? I'm sorry, this is Wolfgang's comment right now. Isn't this also an issue for forum shopping, the ITU-T versus IETF versus ETSI versus IEE, W3C, and of course another key player is the 3GPP. So continuing with that, we also have a nice intervention here. Excuse me, I apologize for my next comment comes from Vince Cerf, and welcome, yes, to all of our audience, including Vince. Wolfgang, yes, a problem to contend with. Related problem, digital or data sovereignty, contributing to fragmentation of the internet. And that is going back, of course, to the conversation on how SDOs love missions creep. So thank you all for your input, and please continue the conversation.
Ginger, well, I'm glad there are quite some inputs, and I'm glad the community of participants is quite rich. So I encourage you again, feel free to raise a hand and jump in and comment live. That's the point of this briefing if you wish to discuss further details. And again, I acknowledge the mix of acronyms that we have, from the names of organizations to the protocols and everything over there. Let me get back briefly to Jovan and then to Sorina with any sort of reflections on these points raised by participants, and again, this sort of a mix of old times of openness and new times of digital sovereignty and all of that. Jovan, firstly to you and then to Sorina.
Sure, Vlada. One important development which happened over the last 20, 30 years is basically a shift of a lot of the digital standardization outside of, let's say, government-influenced organization, traditional standardization development organization like ITU, International Standardization Organization, and International Electrotechnical Commission. I'm not using acronyms, but then it becomes a bit long. And it has happened over the last 20 years, especially around internet technology for various reasons, for the dynamics of the internet, for 5G, what was different dynamics. And what we are seeing now, that this gap that was created, in particular in Geneva, was filled by some countries which became more prominent actors. Like in the case of our study, we noticed that China moved more actively into this empty space. This was one development. Second development, many developing countries which are waking up for the need to be part, or at least to know what's going on, are seeing this standardization development organization easier to access than multiply for us on 5G or internet technology and other issues. And that will be an interesting development, not only of return governments per se, but also creating the gap, which is now filled like any gap, and also growing interest on developing countries to become part of it, where they see traditional standardization development organizations as some sort of easier access points, not necessarily ideological issue, but simply easier access point.
Thanks, Jovan. Let me just check quickly if Sorina has any reflections on this discussion, and then maybe Ginger, if you wish. I see that chat is still active after Sorina. Ginger, if you want to once again get back to the chat, because I see people are shy to raise a hand, but they're not shy to comment, which is good. Sorina.
Thanks, Vlada. Two quick points following up on what Jovan was just saying. First, about more developing countries getting more interested in standardization. As I was saying earlier, I was looking a bit at the candidates for the upcoming WTSA, candidates for chair and vice chair roles for ITUT study groups. And most of them come from the same countries that have been holding these roles for the current study period. But there are also a few new countries coming up with proposals for these roles. And I think that's and one of them is China, which which interestingly has the same number of candidates as China, and both have the largest number, and that's 13 from both of them. But then we also have candidates from Algeria, Iran, Uruguay, Zambia, and Romania. And I think it will be interesting to see whether these stakeholders actually make it to chair or vice chair some of the study groups. And then my second point, I just wanted to mention that it will be interesting to also look at over the next few years at the processes for standardizing, let's call them advanced technologies. Basically those areas where there are less standards already in place, or where standardization is only picking up, AI is already happening, but looking at quantum computing or biotechnologies or these kind of issues, to see which are the countries or stakeholders that are mostly interested in participating in these standardization processes. And again, this is a reflection of how countries and stakeholders are competing across the world. And I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Sorina. Well, we'll definitely have to follow that, and we'll be following in the next months, as well as not just the standards discussion in the ITU, but general developments in the ITU, and not least this sort of a competition for the Secretary General between the US and Russia, which I think signals quite well the increasing importance of not just standards, but generally the work of the ITU for geopolitics. Ginger, I know that there have been a lot of discussions still. Before you take the floor, I just wanted to remind, and I think it was mentioned, that just this afternoon at 4 p.m. Central European time, so we have this International Digital Standards event, mostly focused on Americas, but I invite you to join. And now back to Ginger to see what's happening in the chat. Ginger.
Thank you, Vlada. Yes, we have a very rich chat, as you have indicated. It's hard to summarize, so I'm going to point out some what's going on here. Marilia went back to a previous point where she says she doesn't see anything new in seeking to embed values and standards. The separation between technical and the political has always been artificial. Culture, be it national or professional, and values have always been reflected in technical developments. Perhaps we mistrust what we believe to be the culture and values of new participants while we were okay with the incumbent ones. It seems like a broader political issue that we need to grapple with adequate governance forums, not necessarily SDOs, which seem to be ill-equipped to deal with this type of political play. Richard responded there that SDOs can only do what their members want them to do. So-called mission creep arises when the members of one SDO want to do something, for example, because they're not satisfied with developments in other SDOs. The canonical example is actually TCP/IP, which has developed in competition with Layer 4. Desiree pointed out that in addition to standards, open source development was and is increasingly important. Vint replied to Richard that the chronology was that TCP/IP was nearly completed in 1978 when OSI was started in opposition to it, emphasizing, of course, that this back and forth between ideas is very good for the development. The last point I'd like to make is Wolfgang has just jumped in with a comment that one of the problems that we have had the one world, one internet philosophy, in contrast to the one world, 193 national jurisdictions philosophy with no protocol to link those two worlds. And ending with a question from Monica. What are the most important ITU standards under development currently? How much does the ITU focus, perhaps similarly to ETSI, on frameworks and meta standards? Thank you, Vlada.
Thank you, Ginger. And I must admit, I wouldn't be in your shoes today because there is a flurry of comments, which is excellent. And we'll probably have to follow up with a separate event on standards and maybe more discussion. We'll certainly do that because the topic will remain hot. I invite all of you to continue discussing in the chat, even if we are moving to the next topic, but still you can follow up on that. Maybe you can use the hashtag standards to be able to follow the chat, but I leave it to Ginger. Thank you, Ginger. Now we are moving to the second topic of the day. Basically, we discussed that the topic of cybersecurity is again high as a high pressure on our IG barometer for February. And unfortunately, things are developing faster than we can catch. So we will start immediately with, if we can call it an elephant in the room, which is the Ukraine crisis. There's been a lot of developments, obviously, not least from this morning, about what's happening on the ground in Ukraine. Cyber has been an important component of this general tensions in this region for years. And it is not new, but somehow it seems that in the last couple of, let's say, weeks and months, there was more of the information about physical movements and physical developments and political developments, and not that much about cyber ones. What we want to do now is briefly reflect on facts. So what basically happened in the last couple of weeks when it comes to cyber developments around Ukraine, but have a particular focus on and discuss with you what are the expectations? Can we actually predict what could happen when it comes to cyber developments in this crisis? And also, how do the agreed international norms and international law that everyone agrees applies to cyberspace could be interpreted in this quite a new context? For that, I invite firstly my two colleagues to join me. Andriana Gavrilovic, who is following closely on cyber detente, what we called back from June last year when the two presidents of Russia and US met. She's following and preparing with her team a newsletter related to cyber detente and the relations, which is now coming to probably a different spirit. So I invite Andriana, and I also invite my colleague Pavlina, who is following closely on the international law aspects and humanitarian aspects of cyber negotiations, not least the GG, the open-ended working group, but also, and we will reflect a little bit further on the hack against the ICRC that I mentioned at the beginning and possible humanitarian elements of that. So I'll firstly go to Andriana. Andriana, maybe you can just run through a factual set of updates. What do we know about the developments related to not just the attacks, but also maybe the statements and political opinions coming from different parties in the last weeks when it comes to Ukraine? And then we can turn to also expectations, if we can call it that way. Are there any signals of what each party sees as red lines or ways they might react on different developments and so on? Andriana, over to you.
Thank you for the floor, Vlado. When it comes to Ukraine, the last few months have passed in this anticipation that Russia will preface its physical attack on Ukraine with a large-scale cyber attack. That's what we've been hearing. And what did happen on February 15th was a series of DDoS attacks on Ukraine that at that time were not connected to Russia officially. They weren't attributed to Russia. However, what has come out in the last few days were exactly that, attributions. At that time, the Ukrainian ministry stated that, and I'm quoting here, "It is possible that the aggressor resorted to tactics of petty mischief because his aggressive plans are not working overall." And here they implied Russian involvement. Of course, this was the day before 16th February, which was the supposed date of Russia's alleged invasion on Ukraine, according to President Biden. Obviously, because this was 6 days ago, we know that this didn't happen. And as Russia's envoy to the EU stated very cheekily, wars in Europe rarely start on a Wednesday, and this was another war-free Wednesday for the world. However, in the aftermath of all of this, Ukraine decided to ask for help from the EU, and the EU will deploy a cyber rapid response team, which includes around 10 national cybersecurity officials of 6 European countries that can provide assistance to countries under cyber attack. And this team falls under the EU's Defense Cooperation Program, and it will be its first deployment. This was last Friday. Also last Friday, the US Deputy National Security Advisor for Cyber and Emerging Technology, Anne Neuberger, stated that the US believes that the Russian government is responsible for the cyber attacks in the week of 15th February. Neuberger continued with the claim that the USA has technical information that links the Russian main intelligence directorate, or the GRU, to this attack because known GRU infrastructure was seen transmitting high volumes of communication to Ukraine-based IP addresses and domains. Now back to what I started. This is not a large-scale attack, and Neuberger did touch upon this. She said, while of limited impact, this recent spate of cyber attacks in Ukraine is basically consistent with a Russian effort that could look like it's laying the groundwork for more disruptive cyber attacks, which would accompany a potential further invasion into Ukraine's sovereign territory. The UK has also joined these claims last Friday. They also said that they judged that the GRU was involved in last week's attacks. And so far, what we've heard from Russia is that they are negating these claims. The Russian embassy in Washington is negating it. Foreign Minister of Foreign Affairs Lavrov also underlined that accusations that Russia is leading a cyber war are right out of the highly likely playbook that London is famous for and are not based on facts. So these are the things that happened. These are the reactions to the things that happened, but we also need to talk about the possible consequences. What we do know is that the US is saying that Russia's aggression that is short on military action, which includes cyber attacks, will be met with a decisive and united response. Now, Biden remarked that should Russia continue to use cyber efforts, US can also respond the same way with cyber. And because this was not quite clear, the White House then clarified that the US has a range of contingencies that can be used if Russia should invade Ukraine, if additional steps are taken. And the US has underlined they will continue to be in lockstep with their partners. So far, we haven't seen any of this pan out. But just yesterday, the Ukrainian CERT has issued a warning of possible cyber attacks that should happen today on the websites of the public sector, the banking sector, and the defense sector. And according to this message, any domain that ends in .ua will be defaced. So there's definitely more to follow there. And yes, even the cyber situation is changing from minute to minute. Back to you, Vlado.
Thank you, Andriana, for the overview. We'll certainly continue following that, and we'll use this cyber detente page. It's also a good question whether the change should name, but the name should change, but we hope not. So you can visit Digital Watch in the next days and find the cyber detente page where we'll try to update these developments as well as part of the relations between the US and Russia we've been following when it comes to cyber. And since this is a sort of now a different context where we might see an open conflict and cyber again as part of it, there is an important question of applicability of international law and particularly humanitarian law and generally humanitarian aspects in this context. And there are speculations or worries by various parties that the cyber conflict, if you wish, might not be limited just to the territory of Ukraine, but might actually spill over to all the different parties involved directly and indirectly in these tensions, which might again then cause some worries for escalations. Now, I want to move to Pavlina before passing the floor to Ginger and comments by all of you. And again, I encourage you to raise a hand if you want to jump in. Pavlina, since you are particularly following the legal aspects of humanitarian law and the norms that were agreed in the UNGA, the General Assembly, and all the parties have agreed, this is a different context. What can we expect and how do you see the humanitarian aspects of this cyber warfare, if you wish? Pavlina.
Thank you, Vlada. No, it is a little bit different, but in a sense that we might be living through something which would create some legal norms for the future. So the question of human rights application and application of international humanitarian law has been discussed at the UN for at least 10 years now. In the last 5 years at the first open-ended working group, and then again now in the second open working group, it started again in December. What we've seen was the development of agreement between the countries on application of human rights law, now not humanitarian law. And now application of humanitarian law is directly connected to the most pressing points discussed at the UN at the open-ended working group right now. That is, where is the threshold when you have a cyber attack that can be considered a regular attack? Where does the cyber attack equal to armed attack on a state? And these are the questions which are discussed currently. They do not have answers. However, different states have different opinions about this. The majority of the countries, and ICRC included as one of the stakeholders who has the opportunity to voice their positions at the open-ended working group, maintained that in case of cyber attacks and cyber warfare, international humanitarian law applies, meaning the civilians are affected. There are effects, for example, in cases of cyber attacks against hospitals or water supply or any other critical infrastructure, which would harm the civilians. Therefore, international humanitarian law should apply. And in addition to that, that follows that the country which is attacked by cyber attack like this has the right of self-defense under the Article 51 of the UN Charter. On the other side are countries which do not believe that cyber attack will ever equal a regular attack, a boots on the ground attack. And that is Russia. Russia maintained through the years and still does maintain that cyber attack will never equal a regular kinetic attack, and therefore will never trigger the right to self-defense by the country which is attacked, which of course in the aspects we're looking at now with the Ukraine does get a different meaning. But as far as I've seen the news this morning, we are already in a position where the boots are on the ground and the Security Council of the UN is involved. So it might be that we are at the point where the discussions within the UN, which were for years, will actually have to speed up and have to catch up with the geopolitical tensions. That's it from me. I think Ginger would like to go ahead with the heavy comments in the chat. Thank you.
Thank you, Pavlina. We'll certainly get back to reflections on that. And if I can add to the complexity before passing to Ginger, even though it's not in the same context, but it's related to humanitarian, is the hack against the ICRC, which appeared at the first place that it could have been just a ransomware. The statement a few days ago by the ICRC officials says that they're quite sure that it was an APT or advanced persistent threat, which means a very sophisticated attack, which possibly had a targeted goal to get reach to some of the ICRC sensitive personal data about refugees, displaced personnel, and so on. And in that sense, it's worth following on, again, even if it's not related to the Ukraine conflict, who could have possibly the incentives to hack ICRC, what sort of data could be of interest for different parties, whether state or state-aligned parties, if it is an APT indeed. So we have to follow on that as well. But it's an interesting question in sense of, on one hand, preparedness and resilience of the international organizations, which could become, as we have seen also with other international organizations, a target of also politically motivated attacks. And on the other hand, the role of the humanitarian data and the criticality of it as a possible target. But we can bring that all into discussions. Let me pass the floor now to Ginger. And Ginger, you can reflect on bits about standards still if there is something really outstanding, but I'm sure there are other very interesting bits about cybersecurity. So back to you, Ginger.
Thank you, Vlada. And of course, I try to speak for everyone in the chat. It's impossible. There is a very rich discussion. So I suggest that if you have a chance, take a look. There was some continuation on standards, and we actually foreshadowed, the chat foreshadowed your turn toward cybersecurity and encryption. So there are some interesting allusions. There was also a wonderful overview of perspectives from different parts of the world. And I'd like to remind you that we really appreciate bringing in these details from different areas. More towards where we're going now, Richard brought that in by asking what's happening in the Ukraine. Are there any comparisons to be made with what happened in 1999 regarding Kosovo? Were there cyber attacks by NATO in addition to bombing of Belgrade by NATO? So, and from there, we continued with different input. For instance, Wolfgang asked about the use of laws, in particular drones, in the present conflict. And of course, that's a matter of definition because there are different ways of defining and such a variety of rules. So that is a question that everyone was interested in. Then there was, as you noted, some discussion on the ICRC attack, which perhaps we'll note on. Although, as David says, it's unclear who perpetrated the attack. It was being described as an APT, but nothing more. Arvin had some interesting input that the latest news was that the US military still didn't have laws in the field that would be lethal weapons of automatic weapons, of swarms of drones with autonomous decision-making mechanisms. So what is the point where decision-making actually turns over to AI, and at what point are humans? So it has been, of course, concluded that we must work together, but we'll now turn it back to you to see what your responses are about lethal autonomous weapon systems and choosing targets and the implications for past and future analysis. Thank you.
Thank you, Ginger. Well, quite a set of questions and comments, and it shows how complex this area is. And I think particularly this link with little autonomous weapon systems and laws, where we see increasingly the connection between the two topics, if not the processes, that I'm sure that in future we'll definitely have to see some closer connection between the laws discussion, the GGE on laws, and the continuation of that process, and the Open Annual Working Group when it comes to cyber norms and possibility of hacking these little autonomous weapon systems. If we had some indications of laws used in the previous conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan, we could probably foresee something like this going into field very soon in any type of conflict, not excluding this one. But let me pass the floor to Jovan, and I still invite all of you, we have a couple of more minutes. If anyone wants to grab the mic and comment, you're free to do so. Otherwise, let's go to Jovan. Jovan.
No, just a few reflection and for a really rich discussion. Thank you for all comments, Richard, Wint, Wolfgang, David, and others. It's really great dynamics. There are few questions that I think were not completely answered. One is the question of analogy to NATO action and the cyber aspects during the Kosovo war. At that time, Serbia was not that digitalized as countries that it was 1999. And I still remember that the NATO insisted to keep connection of the internet to Serbia. One of the reasons was that it was a good source of intelligence, what's going on in the country, because people were communicating. At that time, the software was ICQ. That was almost 22 years ago. And that was probably parallel, which is just not that strong analogy. One question which is important is ICRC, obviously. We are in Geneva, and this is the question of protection of data, where data can mean the question of life and death. And we are speaking about 500,000 data units, about people who were leaked. There is some sort of not yet clear information who did it, obviously attribution. There was indication that there was some sort of omission in the update of the software, technical omission. Therefore, on that technical side, I'm sure we'll be hearing more. But what really matters is a question of protection of data. As you know, when it comes to data, we have legal and technical aspect, of course, economic, human rights. But legally speaking, those data are protected by privileges and immunities. No one can be cynical and say, who cares about it on the internet? But it's not necessarily the case. All countries in the world have humanitarian law, national humanitarian law, and have the special status for their Red Cross local organizations. And that law in all countries indicates protection of data, Red Cross symbol, and other elements which are important for functioning of the Red Cross community. Therefore, one can basically start the action if there is any traceability in any country in the world for quoting those people and investigating. Now, my hope is, since very big complexity of attribution generally, that maybe ICRC and humanitarian aspect could be angle that can unite all of us in spite of all differences and say, hey, here is important humanitarian aspect. We have legal instrument, whether it is Russia, United States, China, any country in the world has a legal instrument to investigate who perpetuated that attack. Therefore, that's a missing aspect, legal more than technical in ICRC. And obviously, there is a question of protection of the international organization when it comes to the immunities and privileges on their data. They are protected according to Vienna Convention, but little is done on that. And probably, well, on the laws, on the Volcan question, I think that was clarity, the question of human decision. It was not clear if the Turkish drones in Armenia, Azerbaijan conflicts were making individual decision or they were controlled remotely. We missed the technical details and we know very little what's going on currently in Ukraine on both sides when it comes to use of drones. But one issue, Vlada, which was missing and I think is extremely important, is the question of Pegasus. Pegasus anti-encryption platform sell from Israel to quite a few countries. US government made a move which was completely passed almost unnoticed in this sort of buzz on so many developments. They're trying basically to put Pegasus, and I think they already made some decisions, on the sanctions list, and all countries and companies dealing with Pegasus basically being punishable by the US sanctions law. That's sort of very far-reaching decision because of power of Pegasus, but also even more of the risk of privatizing this type of complex deciphering operation, which used to be monopoly by governments and security services. That's probably for me highlight of the month, that sub-poina made by, I think, Department of Commerce. We can find the details on it. Over to you.
Thank you, Ivan, and thank you for raising this issue about the NSO and the Pegasus. We did want to reflect a little bit more on that. There are other updates which are quite interesting, which is that the FBI actually confirmed that they have purchased the Pegasus software as well, even though they say they haven't used it, but they do have licenses. So it's quite interesting to see what are the developments. There are new developments in India, how it has been used against political personnel and so on. And I remind that in the GGE report in 2021, there is one clause which is related to the development of the existing norms, which actually reflects on not allowing commercial abuse of vulnerabilities and so on. So there is a space to expand this agreement, but let's see how this commercial development of cyber weapons will follow. We'll certainly follow up on that more in the next months, because it will be quite a topic. We have, in a way, spent our hour, so I won't bring it back to Ginger, but you can continue more discussions in chat, and please let us know of any ideas for possible follow-up discussions, webinars. What are the ideas? What are the topics we could expand more, not only in the next briefing, but also in between. With this, and I'm coming back to the end of the briefing, we want to reflect on what's next. Well, when it comes to developments, when it comes to events coming from Diplo, I mentioned the event on standards, which is starting in about an hour. So join us. The other reminder is follow the Cyber Detente page on Digital Watch, and also the other Open Working Group in the other pages on the Digital Watch, because we will be feeding the inputs as they go. Feel free to subscribe to the newsletters on Cyber Detente, on digital policy developments, and so on, and then you get fresh updates. Check out the courses. We'll quite soon open up some new opportunities, new courses related to cybersecurity negotiations and diplomacy, to standards and so on. So stay tuned. And if not earlier, see you for the last Tuesday of next month, which is, if I'm not wrong, 29th of March, for the next Internet Governance briefing. Stay safe and see you soon. Bye-bye.